Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining this talk and for tuning into this live stream. My name is Jemima, and I'm going to be talking to you about accessibility. Just to confirm, I feel like we only have, I think it's 25 minutes for this. So, I'm going to go through the slides quickly. I think my slides are around 20 minutes. If we have time for questions, I will take them. But if not, you could just leave them in the comments and I could get back to them when I see them online. So, accessibility. Let me talk a bit about why I want to give this talk. Basically, when I was in university, we used to stay in dorms in university, and I stayed in a room that was called a special needs room, which is basically accommodation options for students that had disabilities. The students I was staying with, there were two girls. One of them had partial visual impairments, and the other one had complete visual impairment, so she was fully blind. And then I used to help them sometimes. So I would help them maybe use their phones or something. And one thing I would always notice is that when I was scrolling through websites, they just always felt very slow and annoying to use. So because they had these visual impairments, they had accessibility features enabled on their phone. And if you use accessibility features on your phone, you don't have the same experience as somebody that doesn't use these accessibility features. For example, instead of scrolling regularly, you may have to scroll with two fingers. If you want to zoom in, you can't just zoom in like that. You may have to zoom in with three fingers and then use those three fingers to scroll the screen. So basically, I would always feel like, I don't like these accessibility features because they're making the site so laggy and difficult to use. But then when I started learning front end development, I realized it's not that these accessibility features are making the site laggy, it's that these websites weren't built well. These websites weren't built to take accessibility features into account, and that's why the entire experience isn't great. So I basically want to give this talk to give a little exploration into what accessibility is and why, as developers or product managers or designers or people that build anything, we should always be keeping accessibility into consideration when we're building stuff. Okay, so let's get into it. A little introduction about me. Like I said, my name is Jemima Abu. I am a self-taught front-end developer. I've been building websites since 2017. I'm also a Google developer expert in web technologies, a Microsoft MVP in web development, and a certified professional in accessibility core competencies. So basically, you're in good hands for this talk. You can find me online anywhere at Jemima Abu. So that's my LinkedIn or my Twitter. If you do have any questions about this talk that you want to ask me after, just feel free to message me there and I'll get to it. So a little overview into what we'll be discussing in this presentation. We're going to be talking about accessibility as a concept. We're going to explain what does accessibility actually mean. We're going to be talking about the importance of accessibility. So why is it important to build products that can be accessible? And then we'll be going into a little bit of testing about how to know if the products we build are accessible. Because I'm a front-end developer, the testing I'm going to be talking about is um, testing websites, but I think the general logic will also apply to any kind of product you can be building, whether it's mobile apps or even hardware. So, what is accessibility? What does accessibility actually mean? The dictionary definition of accessibility is of something that's able to be reached or entered or easy to use or easily understood. Basically, what that means is that accessibility is what makes a product usable by everyone. And when we say everyone, we should mean everyone. I think as developers, we tend to have maybe tunnel vision or like a certain mindset where we're like, if this thing works for me, then it should work for everybody. You know, it's the age old, it works on my machine, so I don't understand why it's not working on the server. The fact is, things may not work for you in the exact same way that you expect them to work for everybody. So when we say everyone, for example, 16% of the world's population has some form of disability. That means there are 1.3 billion people living with some form of disability or the other. We also have 2.5 billion people using assistive technologies. Now, assistive technologies are tools that people use to help them perform tasks that they may not be able to perform otherwise. For example, I need to wear glasses because I'm very short-sighted. If I took my glasses off, I would not be able to see my slides. So my glasses are an assistive technology for me. So when you're creating your products, it's important to think people that are using my products, how are they using them? If I'm making a website, it might not just be people that are scrolling or using a mouse and a keyboard. It might be people that are using a screen reader. It might be people that are using like sites to move the website. It might be people that are using they even have like a touchpad thing, like a touch to scroll thing that you can use. So there are different ways that people can use these products that you're building. We have a 10% older population, and this is something that has become very prevalent in recent years because humans are living longer, which is great, but it also means that we need to be taking things into consideration because these products that we're building, as people get older, how easy is it for them to use? For example, I don't know about you guys, but my parents, they always have their phone text very large on their phones because that makes it easier for them to see. If phones were built without the ability to increase text, it would mean that the older population could not use these things at all. So these are the kind of things I want to keep in mind. And it may not just be things like even like any physical problem or a mental problem. It could be things like infrastructure. There are people that do not have access to fast internet or internet at all. So if you're building a website that's very slow or very laggy or requires a lot of heavy downloads, you're preventing people from being able to access these websites because it might just not load for them at all and they will just give up. You could also have things that are permanent, temporary, or situational. Disability is not just something that can affect you forever, it's something that can affect you in a certain moment. For example, I don't know if you guys ever, like, if you go outside and you're using your phone and it's very bright overhead, sometimes you may not be able to see your phone at all. I have this one phone I used to use that it would do this really weird thing where whenever I was in direct sunlight, it would reduce the brightness all the way. And when it reduced the brightness all the way, I couldn't see the screen at all. So I would literally be tapping whatever buttons on my phone to try and get it to like increase the brightness back, and sometimes to start making random calls or doing something I didn't intend. That's a useless phone basically, because if I cannot use you in a certain situation because of a certain reason, your that product you're building is not accessibility. It's not accessible. So basically, when we say accessibility, that is what we mean. Accessibility is the process of building useful products, and these products should be useful to everybody. So that's pretty much it. Now we're going to go into a bit of why accessibility is important. And I will give you the most important reason first, which is that it is legally required for you to make things that are accessible. There's a new, well, it's not new, it came out a while ago, but the European Accessibility Act is basically an act that was put into place to ensure that people are building, let's say, online experiences, so things like e commerce or like information websites, and making sure that these products are accessible to people with disabilities. It could also go on to like hardware, like computers, ATMs, smartphones, yada, yada, yada. So, as of 28 June 2025, which is next year, people will be able to file complaints in court if the product you build is not accessible. What this means is you could literally be sued if you build something that is not accessible. And before you go, oh, nobody is going to sue me for building an inaccessible website. Yeah, they will. This is a list of lawsuits that have been served in the US. So the people in America have the Americans with Disability Act, which is similar to the European Accessibility Act. This is a list of people that have been of lawsuits that have been served since 2018. And just to be clear, this list is not cumulative. So it's not like, oh, in 2018 it was 2,300 and then 500 lawsuits more. No, these are new lawsuits every year. It was 2,300 lawsuits in 2018, 2,800 in 2019, with in 2023 was 4,630. So these are actual situations where people have been sued for not having accessible websites. And another thing is there was also a case of someone who was sued for having a previously inaccessible website. I think the person that was suing them, they went on like the Internet Archive or like the Wayback Machine, and then they got the website there, and they were like, you see, in like 28th of January of like 2018, your website wasn't accessible. So they were sued for that, and they had to pay up. So the fact is, if you're building products that are not accessible, you are exposing yourself to serious legal ramifications. And especially if you work, for example, I work in a digital agency, so we build websites for other people. If I'm building something that is exposing my clients to legal, like to lawsuits, that is a big problem for them. And it's a big problem for me as well, because people aren't going to want to use my services. But on the plus side, if you keep building inaccessible websites, you can get to use this very fun sticker on Microsoft Teams. So that is something to look forward to if you build websites that aren't accessible. I'm also going to go a little into business case because, like I said, I'm a developer, and I know that sometimes when you're trying to, let's say, estimate the time that you spend on a project, if you're like, oh, I'll need to spend this much time to make sure that this thing is accessible, like we're building this new carousel, I need to make sure that it works with like mouse users or like keyboard users, and then you'll be like, oh, I might need like an extra day of work. It's possible that your manager or like your PO or whomever and be like, oh, we need to like keep the time short. We're not trying to spend too much time. So can you just skip the accessibility parts? So we're going to go into a little bit of what I call business cases, which is basically how you can convince people at work to let you build things that are accessible. Number one is that accessibility enhances user experience and satisfaction. The fact is, if you are building websites that everyone can use, people are going to want to use them. People are going to spread the word around and be like, oh, this website is really great to use, or this website isn't great to use. It's a similar thing we see with like actual businesses. If there is a business that it has, let's say it has a ramp, it has like conveniently sliding doors, it has automatic opening doors. People that use wheelchairs or people that depend on crutches, they are more likely to go to that business than the one that only has staircases and a door that you need to push manually. So the fact is, the more accessible you make your website, the more people are going to want to use that thing. We also have boosting search engine optimizations. This is basically your ranking for your website on search engines. So things like Google or whatever other search engines they are. This is ensuring that your website shows up on the top pages of those sites, because when search engines are crawling your website, they will also take accessibility into account. They're like, oh, does this thing meet accessibility requirements? And if it does, then you're likely to have a higher ranking than if it doesn't. It prevents alienating users and increases user retention. Like I said earlier, if you're building something that everyone can use, it's more likely that everybody will want to use it. So your users are more likely to keep coming back to your product because they know it's something that caters to their needs. Implement best practices in code. This is something that is specific to front-end developers or developers in general. If you are writing code that is accessible, it means you are doing the right thing when you're writing your code. It's if I'm using semantic HTML, then that is the right way of writing code rather than just throwing everything in a div and calling it a day. Avoid legal ramifications. Like we said, you don't want to be sending the "we got sued" sticker on Microsoft Teams. So this is something that's very, I feel like this should probably be number one, but this is something that is very important for you to communicate to your managers at work, that if you don't spend time making this product accessible, you could all lose your jobs. And it's positive PR. So I think it's a thing we have in recent times, that it's just nicer to say things are more catering to people. It's like if you go to a smoothie bar or if you go to like a fruit stand and they're like, oh, all our fruits are vegan. And it's like, I should hope your fruits are vegan. I've never seen a non-vegan fruit before, but it sounds nicer when you say it that way. It's like, oh, this thing caters to it caters to these people, as opposed to just saying, well, of course it does. That is the default behavior. So that's the same thing with accessibility. So these are all just some reasons for making sure that you can communicate with your people at work to help you build these products that you want. And if that doesn't work, you can always play the shame game. I personally, I'll be in meetings like, wow, you don't want to build something that's accessible? Couldn't be me. So the fact is, at the end of the day, you are still the developer, you are still the one that's in charge of this product. And I feel like if it's something that you're being prevented from doing, just do it anyway. What are they going to do? Go into your code and delete all the semantic HTML? No. So, it's just important to make sure that we know that we're building things or we're putting out things that we would be proud of because we know everyone can use them. And finally, and I think this is the most important reason, the fact is you should be building websites that everybody can use. There's no point in building a website and publishing it and deploying it if everyone can't use that website. So that's just a little bit into why we should care about accessibility and why we should know how important it is to be building accessible products. I also had a little quiz. This doesn't work very well online, but I'll do it anyway. The pop quiz is, whose job is it to make sure products are accessible? So A, designers, developers, content creators, project managers, SEO, or QA specialists. And the answer is trick question. It is everybody's job to make sure things are accessible. If you're building things, you want to make sure that it's accessible from every single, what you call it, level. You want to make sure that from the business proposals to the scoping out the time to the building the designs to writing content to developing it to going to QA, you want to make sure that you are building things that people can use. That's really the simplest way I can put it. So now we can go a bit more into testing accessibility, which is basically just how to know if the things we're building are accessible. So, like I said, since I'm a front end developer, I will be talking about things from the aspect of web testing, but depending on what field or what area of development you work in, there are different ways to test what you're building. So the first way that I like to use to test my websites is the Lighthouse tool in Chrome DevTools. Lighthouse is basically a tool that can give you like results on everything that you've built. And this is the result for my website on Chrome DevTools. Humble brag. Yes. Basically, if you build websites that are, if they meet all the requirements in Chrome DevTools, then you get these nice little fireworks and you get 100%. And as a formerly gifted child like myself, this is very validating. So, if you're the kind of kid that you were constantly hunting for gold stars in school, this is something that you can look forward to when you're building your websites. Another thing I also like to use is the web accessibility evaluation tool. This is good for breaking down your website into structure. So it's especially good for if you use like landmarks like H1 or nav or everything. If you just want to make sure that your website content is written using the right semantics, I would recommend using the web accessibility evaluation tool. There is also accessibility audit. I like this because it's just kind of like a little professional audit in getting results of your website. They're like, oh, you've done this thing right, you could fix this thing and stuff like that. So this is also a really good tool, I think, for testing stuff that you've built on your website already. And there is the web accessibility VS Code extension. So it's a extension that you can have in Visual Studio Code that just basically tells you what you need to update as you're writing. So we can see here that it's testing for using semantic HTML instead of using the div tag, enable pinch to zoom because you shouldn't be preventing people from able to zoom your sites, using the right area labels or the right associative tags when you're building your elements. So it's just things like this that could be very useful because I think sometimes if you're already rushing and you're coding really fast, you might forget that, oh, I didn't put a label on that input field, or I didn't have time to, I didn't use a nav, I used a list tag instead of using a nav tag somewhere. So just things like that, having an extension is useful for that. Just trying to do some math on how much time we have here. Yeah, okay, we're good with this. So basically, when it also comes to web, they also have the WCAG, which is the Web Content Accessibility Guideline. So for those legal ramifications I talked about earlier, if people were suing you, this is what they'll be suing you on basis of. It's basically making sure that your website is perceivable. This means things like perceivable means making sure that people can perceive the content that you have on your site in whatever fashion works for them. So that is, if you're just having like images and videos on your site, how do you make sure that people with visual impairments can see those images? How do you make sure that people who cannot hear can watch those videos? So it's things like providing content, transcript, alt tags, stuff like that. That's basically creating content that can be accessed in different ways as opposed to just ways that you would access it. There's also making sure your website is operable. So operable means how people actually use that site. So it's not just, oh, I'm using my mouse or I'm using my keyboard. It's people that are using screen readers, it's people that are using text to speech, things like that. You want to make sure that you are making a website that people can operate in different ways as well. Understandable, this is basically just if you go on a website and it's written completely in French and you don't speak French, you're not going to understand what's on that website. So it's making sure that the text you're presenting, you have, I mean, I'm not saying don't build websites in French. What I mean is, if you are going to present a website in one language, providing multiple language options is also a great thing. Also, things like using the lang tag so that Google knows to translate it themselves, or whatever website you're or whatever browser you're using knows to translate it. So that's things like understandable. And then robust is just making sure that your website can go on to be used with future tools. So if somebody builds another tool in the future, you want to make sure that it's compatible with current and future user tools. So just a little guideline into it. Obviously, for you would need more information than that for when you're actually building because they do have specific points that you can map against. But yeah, this is a little overview. And then finally, we have what I like to call accessibility first development. I think as developers, we may tend to think of accessibility as an afterthought, like, oh, I'll build the website first and then I'll make it accessible. But I was watching a talk recently and someone said in the talk, someone said that somebody else said that accessibility is like a blueberry muffin, meaning that if you're trying to bake a blueberry muffin, you don't bake a muffin and then shove blueberries inside. And you're like, here, that's a blueberry muffin, because your cafe would close down so quickly and people will give you very bad reviews on Yelp. You want to make sure you're baking in those blueberries from the beginning. That's the same thing with accessibility. You can't just build a website and then throw a bunch of ARIA labels at it and be like, yeah, we're done. That's not going to be a very good website. So I have a thing I like to call accessibility first development, which basically means building websites with accessibility at the forefront while you're building them. So it's things like, yeah, I already said that. Making sure you're creating accessible designs and content according to the WCAG, which is all those perceivable, understandable, and everything I just went over before. It's implementing an accessibility checklist. I feel like as developers, designers, content creators, whatever, this is very important. You want to have a checklist you're literally mapping against and be like, yep, I've done this, I've done that. Everything is navigable, works with keyboards, stuff like that. And it's making a deliberate effort to care about accessibility. And I think this is the most important one because it might be easy to say, oh, but I didn't know I had to make that site accessible. If I'm driving and I make it an illegal U-turn on the road, I'm not going to say, oh, I didn't know I couldn't make a U-turn here. I'm going to get a ticket regardless. Same thing with accessibility. You need to make sure you know that what you're building is accessible, because as the developer, it's your job, you know. So just make sure everything you're building is accessible, and you'll be great, and you probably won't get sued. Yay! So if you do want to read up some more on this, I think because the EU thing is probably the most pressing one, I would say. I linked some resources that you can check out to learn more about that next year. There's also a YouTube video from a lady that has, I think it's visual impairments, where she basically shows how she uses her devices. And I think that's really great for mapping against how you test websites, because manual testing is also very important. Whew, I'm done. I've talked really fast, but we made it. It was under 25 minutes. So yeah, this is the QR code. If you do want to review my talk, like I said, former gifted child, love those validations. If you want to review my talk and go tell me very nice things, I'm like, oh my God, Jemima, your talk was so great. This is the place for you to do that. If you don't want to tell me nice things, don't. I'm joking. Constructive criticism is great as well. But yeah, you can scan this QR code and leave any feedback. And thank you guys so much for listening. I hope you enjoyed the talk. If you have any questions, like I said, I can take them online, oh, offline. Okay, I'll leave the QR code on the screen for now in case anybody else wants to scan it. But yeah, I'm done. Thank you so much.